Welcome everyone to the Langley Adams Library in Groveland. Today we have Jason Oker, who has written the New England Grimpendium and Poland, as well as the New York Grimpendium. Will be here tonight to talk with us. And I just wanted to mention a few programs that are coming up. Wednesday night we have a Halloween party where your family-friendly costumes. It's at 6 o'clock. And then coming up in November, we have several different programs. Kate Floor, who's a mystery author and true crime, will be coming on Monday, November 10th for 6:30. And we will also be having Rory Raven, who is a mentalist and mind bender, coming on Monday, November 24th, and that's from 6 to 7. And throughout November and December, we will be showing the 75th anniversary films for 1939. The first one we'll actually show is the greatest year, which is 1939, and that will give a review of all the different films that came out that year. And then the first one that we'll have is on November 4th, which is voting day, and that's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. So, and that will be at 2 p.m. on all of those Tuesdays throughout November and December. But for now, I want to welcome Jason Oker.
Okay, well, I appreciate you guys coming, to hear me talk tonight about random things. Reason why I'm up here, I guess, is mostly because I travel to things. These could be any kind of oddities, from oddities of nature, art, culture, history, and mostly I write about them for my website, oddthingsiveseen.com, which I call Otis for short. It's a wide range of things. It could be anything from a shipwreck on the beach in Oregon to a statue of Jim Henson talking to Kermit the Frog at a college in Maryland. Anything that kind of sticks out to me and that I find interesting enough to go see, take a picture of, touch, has a physical presence that you can access. And then I write about it. One of the as I said, it's very oh, I'm starting off so rough today. Take it easy. All right, so one of the themes of Otis that happens a lot is the macabre, the spooky, the weird. I don't know why. I'm a big fan of the shape of the human skull and the way an old cemetery feels and spooky houses and all that kind of stuff just appeals to me on some kind of aesthetic level. So I end up visiting a lot of spooky sites everywhere I go. And that turned into books somehow. My first two books, the New England Grimpendium and the New York Grimpendium, Grimpendium just being a made-up word that shoves grim and compendium together a little bit ineloquently, honestly. But it's just my travelogues of my time visiting death-related sites all around those regions, New England and New York. And when I say death-related, I like to say that the dark has a lot of shades. So when I say death-related, I have a gigantic definition for death-related. That could be anything from the whimsical and lighthearted to the depressing, dark side of the macabre as well. To give you some examples of that, the way I divide the Grimpendiums, I divide them into 5 sections. Legends of personalities, macabre. So these are anybody, directors, actors, writers, painters, artists who have somehow made their name by creating dark stuff. Whether it's horror movies or dark paintings or anything like that. They've made their name that way. Then I like to visit sites connected to them, whether it's their grave, if they're deceased, a house that inspired one of their stories, or any kind of connection to them. Again, a physical connection I can go see and access and take a picture of, and I do that. The second section is the dark one, the infamous crimes, killers, and tragedies. These are the bad things that happen that for some reason we need to memorialize. Well, it's a complex subject. We need to memorialize them so we can have access to them, or part in them, and just remember them. So I'm always looking out for those as well, whether it's a statue, a plaque, a site where something happened, a testament to a victim, and I'll show you examples of all these tonight. Just in the state of Massachusetts, so I've kind of constrained my range to the state that we're in. So some of these things you'll be maybe familiar with, some of these you might not be. We'll see as we go along. Third section is horror filming, horror movie filming locations. For some reason, Hollywood loves New England when it comes to horror movies. They love to film here, whether it's the age, one of the oldest areas in the country as far as the United States goes. Maybe it's the sense of it. Maybe it's Salem. Who knows? They always love to film horror movies in New England, so I love to actually go out there and see them. The first thing I do when I watch a movie, any movie, is I try to find out where it was filmed, just because that sense of place just appeals to me. And fourth is kind of self-explanatory, fascinating cemeteries. I love cemeteries. I'm from Maryland, so I didn't grow up in New England. I moved up here 2008, I believe, is when I moved up here. And one of the reasons I loved coming here is because of all the cemeteries you guys have. And they're old and they're very unique, and the funerary art is really morbid. And they're everywhere. When I go to the grocery store, I pass 3 graveyards just on the way to the grocery store. And back where I'm from, which is a brand new area, we don't have any of that. It's just a very New England thing, and a very interesting thing. And the fifth one's a little weird, classic monsters. This is a site's connected to anything that we would consider a monster in a story. Say, a vampire, mummies, ghosts, demons. That, again, have some kind of physical thing to go see. And I'll have some examples of that as well. So all this sounds pretty weird, it's somewhat exotic, but the thing about the travels I do, they're extremely accessible to everybody. So in the books, there's hundreds of sites. I would say 99% of what's in the books, those 2 books, are accessible to anybody. You can just go see them. There's like 1% where I played them, writing a book card and got in, but you could also play that card if you want. They let you in right in for that. The other thing is, I would say about, again, we're looking at between the 2 books, 500 sites. I would say about 80% of them are free. There's no, they're not attractions. There are some attractions in there, but they're not attractions you pay for. They're just sites you can go see, and they're all, within, a tank of gas or 2 is what you're paying for to see some of these things. So I'm a big proponent of that, just going out and seeing. First thing I did when I moved to New England was just make a map of everything I wanted to see, and I still have that map. If you go to my website, oddthingsiveseen.com, I've made the map public. It's interactive. It's got pins everywhere I've been in New England, everywhere I want to go in New England. I think there's like 500 sites. And again, it's filtered by my, what I like and what I want to see. So, it's a little bit curated. But every weekend there's always something to see. If you, just fill up your tank if you go out there. So what I did for tonight's presentation is just I kind of randomly threw sites from all these kind of categories into just a big hodgepodge that I'll kind of show you pictures of and walk you through the stories. Again, no real connection, bad segues in between them, the whole deal. And at the end, I'll tell you about my latest book that came out this month and how it's relevant to this topic and just Massachusetts in general. So an example of what I like to see, this is a grave of a pretty famous children's author. It's actually over in April. So I picked that obviously because we're in the area. But this is John Belair's, who's born in Michigan, died in April in 1991. But pretty much made his fame on writing spooky children's books. They're mysteries. They always have witches and magic and all the cool things you want to read as a child, and now actually as adults we still want to read that. So the interesting thing about this author's grave, so I've been to scores and scores and scores of author's grave. Literary is another theme that runs through this that I'm a big fan of. The interesting thing about Belair's grave that I've never seen in another grave is that on the back of it, it has a selected bibliography. So you can walk right up to it and kind of just have a reading list straight from his tomb. You see the title, The Letter of the Witch in the Ring, Face in the Frost, The House with the Clock in its Walls, which is a good Halloween book, by the way, to read with your kids or just by yourself, which is what I did last month. But it's right there in Haverhill, right in Greenwood Cemetery on East Broadway. His grave's right up toward the front, right by the chain link fence. Well worth seeing. Because again, it gives you this connection to an author. You can read his book anytime you want, but actually see the place where his final resting place kind of adds a dimension to that experience of reading his books. So next, we're going to go to another famous grave. Because again, I love graves of famous people. To meet famous people in real life, you have to go to conventions and travel to LA and hang outside the windows of expensive restaurants. But once they're dead, You can go visit them anytime you want. And this is the grave of the first ever werewolf in a major Hollywood motion picture. This is Warner Oland. This is over in Southborough. And that movie is Werewolf of London, a Universal Studios film from 1935. He doesn't play the titular werewolf. That's Henry Hall's role, who is the Werewolf of London in the movie. But as anybody who's seen a werewolf movie knows, before that protagonist becomes a werewolf, he has to get bit by another werewolf. So there's always a preceding werewolf. It's some kind of horror law that you need a werewolf to have a werewolf. And in this case, it was Warner Oland was the very first werewolf. This is Warner here in his chair, and behind him there's Henry Hall, and actually a picture of him as a werewolf. So a very brief flash, probably was a stuntman, but he played the human version of the werewolf throughout the movie. Interesting thing about Oland is his most famous roles was Charlie Chan. He played the detective Charlie Chan. Also Fu Manchu, played him a lot. And in Werewolf of London, he was also another Asian character. But the thing about Warner Oland is he didn't have an Asian gene in his entire body. He was straight out of Sweden, like straight out of Sweden. Just ended up in Southborough toward the end of his life. I guess close access to New York and far enough away that you're not too close to New York. Ended up in Southborough. You can actually see, besides his grave, his house, which is still standing there, not too far away. It's right, actually the road beside it is named after him, Oland Drive. This is a private residence now, but you can drive right past it and stand awkwardly in front of it and take pictures. But I really love this, that we have this connection to old Hollywood across the country and here, almost a century later. There's another grave in New Hampshire. It's one of my favorite sites in New England, which is the grave of Claude Rains, who played the Invisible Man in the 1933 Universal Studios picture. It's right there in Moldenboro, New Hampshire. You can just go see it and just, have that connection to this movie that was made decades and decades ago in a whole different part of the country. So those are kind of examples of my legends of the macabre. I definitely stress the term macabre a bit. I also kind of want to talk to you, because I definitely am a little flippant with the macabre, with death-related things. And I always want to bring it down a little bit to realize, it also is, death is not a fun thing totally. Which is why I try to include, memorials to tragedies, bad situations like that. So one in particular that I try to bring up a lot, just because of the strange connection it has to Massachusetts, is this one. This is Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth Short is probably the country's most famous murder victim. It's a California story actually. She was murdered in California. But what I find compelling about her story is, usually when you have these cases of murder, it's always the murderer who is the famous one. He gets the nickname. We've all heard the Boston Strangler. None of us could probably name any of his, half a dozen victims. But in this case, it was Elizabeth Short that got the nickname. She's known as the Black Dahlia, and famous in our culture. Stories have been written about her, movies have been made about her. And obviously it's mysterious both because we never caught her perpetrator, whoever did it, was never caught. The circumstances of her death are really grisly, which again, kind of fascinates us. But even more fascinating to me than that is that she's memorialized in Medford, of all places. They have a big rock out there with her whole story on the plaque there. And the reason is she grew up in Medford. She was from Hyde Park, but moved to Medford. Lived there for a few years. She died when she was 22, so obviously not very long. The house where she grew up isn't around anymore. They demolished it for a I-93 roundabout, or rotaries, how we call it here, rotaries. But what I kind of really find interesting about this story is, it's a terrible story, caught the national attention back when it happened, and yet, we still want a part of that, even though it's a horrible story. Medford still doesn't hit. But Medford still wanted to say, or at least their historical society wanted to say, hey, we have a part in this tragedy as well, which is what usually happens with tragedy, right? You always want to find out, did you know anybody that was involved in it? Did you ever live near that place? So there's this connection to tragedy that helps us get through it, deal with it, and I guess get prepared for the next one. They always seem to be happening. But yeah, the Black Dahlia, one of the most famous victims of all in our country, memorialized right in Medford.
Where is it? Is it near anything where she lived or something?
Yeah, so it's near her house. So the house is gone, and now it's a roundabout, and just off the roundabout, so about 10 feet in front of this is the road, and behind it is a parking lot, but it's just right there. You literally would have to know it was there to go see it, because you would just see a rock with a random plaque on it, like we see everywhere in Massachusetts. Tons of stuff happens. Next, also in that same kind of section, but far enough away from us that it's not as grisly, is an artifact found in the Boston Athenaeum, which is on Beacon Street in downtown Boston. The Athenaeum is a membership library, meaning you have to pay dues to access its materials, its resources, and pretty much just to be there. But they let me in again. I'm writing a book card. They let me in to see this one artifact I wanted to see, and it was this one, which is a humble-looking little book. And it's actually the autobiography. I know you're trying to read that. It's actually Latin, so it's not just blurry. It's blurry in Latin. So it's the autobiography of a highwayman named James Allen. He was. This was back in the early 1800s. It's not a very compelling autobiography. It's actually online, digitized, and you can read it yourself. It's very thin. But he basically robbed people on highways, I guess. He basically robbed people. He was finally caught when one of the guys he tried to attack, named John Finno, wrestled him down, won the fight, and he got, James Allen got shipped off to jail. While in jail, he contracted influenza and basically died in jail. But before he died, on his deathbed, one of the workers at the prison talked him into writing his autobiography, or at least dictating it. But James Allen, for whatever reason, we don't know the reason, went a step forward, a step beyond just writing his autobiography. He actually had the book wrapped in his own skin. Sent it out to a bookbinder, had it tanned. There were 2 versions made. I don't know what happened. We don't know what happened to one of them, but the other one, he said, give it to John Finno. For whatever reason, he really respected this guy that took him down in a fight. So he wanted to give him that book, and the book was in the Finno family for generations before they finally donated it to the Boston Athenaeum. But I've seen the book. It looks like a regular book. You'd never know it's human skin. It actually happens a lot. It happens enough that they have a term for when this happens, and I always mess it up. So let me just look at it. Anthropodermic bibliopeggy. That's what they call it when you wrap a book in human skin. It happens with criminals. It happens with, which makes kind of sense, or autobiographies, I should say, which makes a kind of sense if you want more of yourself in this book. It happens with anatomical texts, which again makes a kind of weird sense that you would do that. It also happens with a lot with religious texts. Obviously some religions are really obsessed with relics, pieces of saints, pieces of holy people. So why not just wrap your book in one? That makes sense too, right? So it's something that happens every once in a while. It's really disconcerting to think about, but the reality of it isn't that bad. It's a book with tanned leather on it. So again, though, anytime you're down there by the Common and walk past Beacon Street, that's right in that collection there. So I was thinking you talk about spooky places. A really great topic to jump onto is ghost towns. In New England, I've been to quite a few ghost towns. They're always the same. It's usually just a bunch of cellar holes in the forest. It's never that Wild West kind of tumbleweed and old facades. It's just not that way in New England. There's just cellar holes in the forest. And if we're lucky, maybe somebody labeled it and told us which colonial settler that cellar once belonged to. The one exception I found in my travels is the ghost town of Dana, which is in central Massachusetts. Dana is an interesting story. It was established in 1801, lasted until about 1930, and was a relatively prosperous little town. There was no economic downturn that made them evacuate it, no tragedy that destroyed half the town. It was actually part of the Quabbin Reservoir Project, where they took 3 or 4 towns, evacuated some 2,500 people, raised the buildings, made it safe enough to flood, so the people in Boston could take a bath every once in a while. But what happened was, after they flooded it, not all of Dana went underwater. Some of it stayed above water. So now just they have this awkward situation where they tore down all these buildings, and it's not underwater. So they turned into a park. So this is a really great place to go, because usually when you think of abandoned places, you think of trespassing laws and vandals and unsavory characters hiding in the shadows of the place. But here it's open to everybody. You take a little path through the forest, and then it opens up onto this wide open field, basically, which was the Dana Town Common. And there you'll see historical placards with pictures of buildings that tells you what was there. You'll see walls. This is an old cellar, and of course you'll see the classic New England cellar holes as well. So it's a really cool place. Take your kids, have a picnic there. It's literally a park. And then when they go to school the next day, you can say, "Hey, we went to a ghost town," and it sounds awesome, even though it's basically the experience of a park. Another thing that I find a lot in Massachusetts for some reason is abandoned medical complexes. I feel like every week I learn about a new one after being here for 6-7 years now. I'm still constantly learning about new abandoned medical facilities. And the story of every single one of them is almost exactly the same. They were all erected in the 19th century as massive grand scheme plans to care for the sick and the indigent and the people with no other recourse. Then over the years, they get overcrowded, the budgets get slashed, treatment methods change, attitudes toward treatment change and evolve, and then they just shut them down. So just these massive beasts that are hard to keep funded for more than a century, I guess. So then what happens? They shut them down, and they go abandoned for another good couple of decades. And then the end of that story is a developer will come in and turn it into condos, or refurbish it into a new medical facility. But basically, that's how that story will end. And again, the one exception I've seen, the one really good exception, is Medfield State Hospital in Medfield. It has the same story. It was erected during that big boom of medical facilities, and when abandoned, which is where it is right now. It's in the abandoned phase of that story. But the interesting thing about this, right now, currently at least, it's open as a park. You can basically walk among. It's about 1,000 acres, 60 buildings. All the buildings are shut, sealed. There's like no trespassing, danger, asbestos, all those kind of signs all over the buildings. But you can walk among them with no problems. There's like a security guy that sits there in a car, lets you in, and he just drive around and keep tabs on people. It's a kind of an amazing opportunity to walk among these old buildings, almost like a movie set, just to see something you don't usually get to see. At some point, I'm sure it'll get locked down and turned into condos or something. For right now, again, abandoned buildings, you think of this whole vandal mentality and no trespassing, but this is something you can go, take your kids, have a good time, and then they have another good story Monday when they're in school. And of course, with every single old medical facility, there's always an old graveyard nearby, just because they have a large population to serve, so they need that as well. And just like all the other places, Medfield has its own cemetery as well. It's just around the corner that you can go see after you wander through abandoned medical buildings. So this time I have a segue. Speaking of medical, that's my segue. One of my favorite things to visit across the country is medical museums. So these are, facilities dedicated to preserving the history of medicine, which is a strange history. It took us a while to get medicine down. There's antique implements. There's, malformed, body parts. There's disease casts in wax. There's all kinds of weird stuff in medical museums. And the best one in Massachusetts is the Warren Anatomical Museum. This is in Harvard. It's in their Francis Conway Library. Absolutely free. You just go in. It's a big, gigantic library facility, but you go in at the front desk and say, hey, I want to see, weird medical stuff. And they'll say, go to the third floor and don't take pictures. So you go to the third floor, and it's just full of stuff that you want to take pictures of. There's, like I said, there's malformed organic abnormalities. There's antique medical implements. That is a, what do you call it when they sever limbs?
Bone saw.
Bone saw.
Yeah, bone saw right there, which we're going to come back to here in a little bit for another oddity. But all kinds of amazingly weird, grisly stuff that is all, not for the sake of the morbid, but to show the history of medicine, see how far we've come and how far we still have yet to go, as we're still probably doing pretty barbaric things. The most famous piece is that skull with the hole in it up there. That's the skull of Phineas Gage. He's pretty famous in medical textbooks. He was a guy out in Vermont. He was, he was tasked with helping blow up rocks so they can lay a railway down. Well, he would do that. He would drill, him and his team or whatever, would drill a hole into a rock. He would fill it with gunpowder, some tamping materials, and then he'd have this long, about 3-foot long metal rod pointed at one end, flat at the other. He would use the flat end to jam all the materials in there nice and tight, and they would light it, and they would all run waving their arms, I assumed, for protection until that thing blew up and destroyed the rock. At one point, that didn't go that way. For some reason, the gunpowder ignited, and the pointy end of it went directly through his skull and landed about 20 feet behind him, just a giant hole all the way through his head. He remained conscious the entire time and even lived to tell the tale. This was in the 19th century, so this was pretty amazing. It's pretty miraculous. He lived, went on and lived a relatively normal life. He had one bad eye, his skull is now on display, which is kind of immortality very few of us will have. Also on display is the actual tamping iron, which is huge, about that thick enough that they actually engraved it with the story. It had that much surface area that they could do that. But you can go see it. Out in Vermont, they actually have a whole plaque dedicated to the event, all the locations that are relevant to Doctor's house and where that happened, right there in the town park. So a pretty famous story. That all that had to happen was somebody had to have a rod through their head. So the next one I want to show you it's an attraction. It's a pretty mainstream attraction. I'd be surprised if most of you didn't already know about it, but I really wanted to hit on just how even with the attractions we go to that we're used to, that we wouldn't even consider oddities, how odd they actually are. And one of the jewels of this area that we always overlook, I've been here 8 years, and I've been there twice, so I'm constantly overlooking it myself, is Hammond Castle out in Gloucester. Hammond Castle is one of the things you take friends to when they come visit you, but it's an amazing thing to have. This is the actual castle of a wealthy inventor named John Hammond. He made his money by selling tons of patents. He pioneered remote control technology. So he had a lot of patents, sold to the government, sold to everybody else, and just had enough money that he could import all the building materials from Europe and create his own castle. There's like Roman tombstones in the walls, or just all kinds of really cool macabre stuff. Inside, it's pretty amazing. Here's the Great Hall. He also imported the facades of buildings, entire buildings, into his castle, so that there's a courtyard that feels like you're actually walking outside into a European, whatever villa. There's like a skylight, and the facades surround you. There's a fountain in the middle. It's really, really nice. Exactly what you hope, extremely wealthy people do with their money. It's weird stuff. But he also got involved in the paranormal. So after he conquered, the natural laws, and patented just about every one of them, he started doing experiments on mediums and psychics. Just anybody that that said they could talk to the dead. He would stick them into a Faraday cage, just this big box where they run a bazillion volts of electricity through, and just do experiments. There's pictures of him in the museum of dressed all in black with like a pointed hood on and just like very almost occultic look to him. Other pictures of him just surrounded by cats. Just the exact thing we want rich people to do is just be weird with their money once they get it all. My favorite thing is a statue or sculpture on the common dedicated to that moment where ether was discovered. There's little like reliefs all over it. It's very tall and very dramatic, and literally it's just this point in time where they put a guy under and remove something from his body. So it's a fascinating place, but that's not why I take people to see this room. I take people to see this room because in that room is this guy. I love mummies. Again, this goes back to that classic monsters kind of angle. I love anything to do with Egypt, and they're everywhere here. Obviously, every single art museum, history museum has an Egyptian wing. Museum of Fine Arts has an amazing, just a great exhibit of Egyptian artifacts and mummies. But I also like to find mummies in weird places. I found them all over the country in places like graves, some Christian graves, in bathrooms. There's a couple of mummies in a bathroom in West Virginia on display. Not Egyptian mummies, homemade U.S. mummies in a bathroom in West Virginia. But this guy is really a fascinating species because he was the first ever complete mummy ensemble to come to the United States. And what I mean by that is full body with the sarcophagus that tells his story. It was all one piece. His name was Paddy Hershoff, and he was a stoneworker in Thebes about 2,500 years ago. So Massachusetts General Hospital actually received this mummy as a gift from a wealthy benefactor. So what they did with it is they toured it around the United States as a fundraising tour. At the time this was 1823 when they got the mummy. Egypt stuff was big in the news. You're hearing exotic tales from the tombs of the pharaohs. And of course, nobody had seen a Boris Karloff movie yet. So the opportunity to see a real mummy face to face was something people would pay money for. So they toured it around, made some cash, and then eventually retired it to the Ether Dome, where it was sitting or standing when the actual Ether Dome or the Ether demonstration went around. You can see old pictures of it. You can see this like mummy in the background just kind of looming there. This is an old picture of him. I guess last year they actually had a big press event where they actually took the mummy out of his case and cleaned him. I was there and going to take some pictures. So you could see him up close, I guess breathe him in. I don't know what it is. He was outside of glass, basically. And these days, actually, I'm have him in a brand new climate-controlled case. I think it's horizontal now, very state-of-the-art. But again, the beautiful thing is free. You just have to go in there, go to the front desk. It's a very imposing place, Massachusetts General Hospital, but make your way past all the medevac copters and the ambulances and the guys telling you to put your cameras away. And just go to the front desk and say, I want to see the Ether Dome. And they'll say, you can go to the 3rd floor and go there. It's always open except for when they're actually doing classes in that operating theater, which happens sometimes, but it's usually wide open to anybody who wants to go see it. So the next thing I want to show you guys is a great story, which I'm sure actually some of you know, about Dungeon Rock in Lynn Woods. I'm a big fan of Lynn Woods. It's full of great things, like Skull Cliff, which is actually not coming through very well in the picture. Skull Cliff isn't really on the tour brochure you see from the woods that you can get. It's a big abandoned quarry that somebody in 2001 just painted Technicolor skulls all over the side of it. It's a massive, massive cliff. You can climb to the top of it and see Boston. But a very cool thing that's not on the map. But what's on the map is Dungeon Rock. And I always try to use Dungeon Rock in my presentations about the Grimpendiums because it's got such a great two-level story. So it's got one story that's basically legend and lore, and nobody's sure if it's ever true. Then it's got this historical story that's connected to another story and makes, it's just a proof to me that, every so often you can make a story better just by being involved in it. So the story of Dungeon Rock, the reason why it's called Dungeon Rock is because it was a pirate's dungeon, put it that way. A pirate named Thomas Veal in the 1600s is supposed to have hid out in the rock in a cave on top of his treasure hoard that pirates all retire with, and just lived there. He would trade with the town, he would just hang out in his cave with his treasure. I'm not sure what he would do, but he was there long enough until a storm hit, the cave collapsed, Veal was lost to time, as was his treasure. That's the story that nobody can really prove or has any evidence of. It's just a story we have. Then in 1852, a man named Hiram Brown started telling people, hey, Thomas Veal is visiting me in my dreams. I think I know where the treasure is. So he went, bought Dungeon Rock, bought the land around it, took his wife, his son, set up a nice little house, and they started excavating Dungeon Rock. They made it their life's work. They would go in there, they would use dynamite pickaxes and start digging a cave for this legendary treasure. Didn't find it. Hiram actually died, during doing this work. Was buried in a nearby cemetery. His son, Edwin, continued the family business and kept trying to find this treasure until he also died. He's actually buried right here somewhere. There's a big pink rock he's buried under on the property itself. But the beautiful thing about that is the cave is still there. You walk into this little crevice, you turn to your, whatever this is, right? And then there's going to be a steel door. Probably shut. The best thing to do is to call ahead, let a park ranger know you want to see it, or they have events every year, or just get lucky and maybe it's open. You go in there, there's a rickety wooden steps down to the bottom of the cave floor. Bring a flashlight because it's dark in there. And the cave just winds for about, 110 feet, just randomly. Because what they would do is they would conduct seances as they were digging to kind of, so the pirate would tell them where to dig. Turn left, turn right. It's almost there. You keep going. So it's this crazy little, cave that ends in stagnant water at the far end. But again, simple little cave, kind of boring in a way, but the stories make it so interesting. You do this one day, one Saturday morning, and you'll be talking about it for the rest of your life, like I am doing, I guess. This is like years and years ago. So I got one more thing to show you guys, one-ish more thing. So my latest book that came out this month is Poland. Poland's a little bit different from the Grimpendiums. Still a travelogue, still an account of my time visiting things. But instead of a book about a place, it's a book about a person. So I spent all of 2013, some of 2014, maybe some of 2012, visiting sites connected to Poe. These are museums, artifacts, statues, preserved places, all the way from north of Boston through 6 or 7 states that have Poe stuff, all the way down to South Carolina and across the ocean in London, since he spent a good 5 years in London. And basically, I just cataloged my experiences going to these sites, meeting the people who actually, maintain this physical legacy, which is, I say physical legacy because it's apart from his literary legacy. That's the scholars and the readers, they're maintaining that. But the museum managers, the collectors, the private citizens that just want a plaque to Poe, in their town. I get to talk to all these people, interview them, and just, hit 6 or 7 states. And the reason why I could do that is for 2 reasons. One is because Poe was pretty itinerant in his life. He lived in Massachusetts, he lived in New York, he lived in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, South Carolina. He lived in all these states, trying to find survival, trying to find fame, recognition, trying to find a life. London, I mentioned that already. And the other side of it is Poe is extremely venerated in our culture. He's one of the most recognizable faces we have in our culture. Charles Dickens is this big, beardy impression to me. Half the presidents of the United States I couldn't pick out of a lineup. But Poe, we just know. We see him in culture, and for good reason. He's an inspiration. It's impossible to escape his influence in any of our stories, our arts, our media. he's just always there. And it's a very weird phenomenon, it's Edgar Allan Poe, and a big reason why I undertook this journey is because I wanted to try to figure that out. It didn't make any sense to me. I loved it. I'm a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe, so I kind of got it on a primal level, but intellectually it just didn't make sense to this guy who lived for 40 years and wrote some horror stories and some other stuff. Would have such an impact on not just U.S. culture, but global culture as well. But I got to write about Poe in the New England Grimpendium. I actually got to write about him in the New York Grimpendium, but I finally got to dedicate an entire book to him. And the reason why I'm bringing him up in this, Massachusetts Grimpendium talk is his relevance to Massachusetts. He was born in Boston. He's a Bostonian. For the longest time, that wasn't well known. He wasn't in Boston very long. His parents were traveling actors, and they took off for other stages pretty soon after he was born. But he was constantly coming back to the Boston and Boston area. He joined the military here. His first ever book was printed here. He would visit friends in Lowell and Westford all the time. He tried to commit suicide in Boston. He was thinking about moving there toward the end of his life. Well, he didn't know it was the end of his life, but he was planning on moving there, at some point later in his life. So Boston always had this kind of pull for him. The weird thing is, though, is that Boston, for most of its existence post-Poe, never really claimed his legacy, which is weird, right? We know Boston. We know it is obsessed with its heritage. It doesn't matter what science and medicine across the river in Cambridge, its sports teams, its colonial history. It loves its for good reason loves its heritage. I often say that the Freedom Trail is less a guideline and more an emphatic underline, just saying look at the cool stuff we have. So the fact they weren't claiming one of the most famous, influential writers in U.S. history is a strange situation. And the usual story for that is that Poe actually hated Boston, so Boston kind of hated him back. And there is some proof of that. Some of the best insults directed at Boston were from Edgar Allan Poe. And the reason for that, it was less a testament to Boston as a whole and more its literacy. At the time, Boston was known for its poets, its transcendentalist poets, Whitman and Lowell and all those guys. And Poe felt that poetry should never have a moral, should never have a lesson. It should be a thing of beauty that you read, you marvel at, it affects you, you're moved by it, and that's it. There shouldn't be no lesson shoved in there. There should be no any kind of didacticism at all. It should just be a poem. So for that reason, he had a lot of bad things to say about the poets of Boston. Of course, a lot of that was also probably motivated by the fact they were all pretty well known in their day, and he was much, much less so. He used to call Boston Frogpondium, which was a reference to the frog pond out in the common, which today is a child's recreation area. Back in the day, it was a stinking morass of a swamp. He would call the residents Frogpondians because he likened them to croaky parochial frogs, just croaking out lessons to each other and not really caring about much else. But that's the story. So Poe said some hideous stuff about Boston, so Boston was kind of apathetic to this gem, this treasure they could have had for decades as a big, whatever, a cool thing to have. That was a story for a long time. It's now a completely irrelevant story as of this month. Earlier this month, October 5th, actually unveiled a full-size statue of Edgar Allan Poe in Boston. This is actually a pretty big thing as far as Poe goes for a couple of reasons. One is, in my travels, I found two other full-size Poe statues, one in Richmond and one in Baltimore. So, Boston now has this level of, one of the few cities to have a Poe statue. The second reason why it's big is because those statues are very literary statues. They're both Poe sitting in a chair. One of them, he has a quill in his hand, books under his arm. This is not a literary statue at all. This is a superhero statue. This is a very cocky statue. And the reason behind that, I got to interview the sculptor for it, Stephanie Rocknack. She said she was trying to depict Poe's triumphal return to Boston. So during his lifetime, he didn't receive a lot of credit for his work, poor his entire lifetime. That compared to the number of accolades he has today, almost it's like the definition of a cosmic joke. So she's depicting him as a guy coming back and accepting all his accolades. So he's really cocky, he's striding through Boston. She says it's not Boston claiming Poe, but Poe claiming Boston. That's why she has the raven there and his coat flying back. He's actually on his way toward his birth home, which, by the way, Boston tore down in the early 1960s to make way for a municipal electricity place. It was a townhouse. It was on what was then Carver Street, was now Charles Street. And the house right beside it survived. It's still there today. You can go see it. Nobody was born there. You know, it's just a really nice house. And right beside that is this empty scar of a building with a big giant transformer sitting in a parking lot. Again, that goes into that whole story of Boston, you know, not being a fan of Poe.
Where is that one?
This is,
Yeah.
so this, that's what I was about to get at. This is pretty big. So this is at the corner of Boylston and Charles Streets, which means it's right across from the Common is right there, the Garden's right there. And the reason why that's pretty big is most Poe sites everywhere else in the world are in off the beaten path. They're not in touristy areas. Some of them are in downright bad areas. The only way you go to these places if you were a dedicated Poe fan, or you know had gotten received in advance from a publisher to go do it, which is how it happened with me. But this is the only one that's in a major tourist spot, and people are going to be, you know, crowds of people are going to be passing this every day. Even if they don't know who Poe is, they're going to see this statue, want to take pictures of it, because all the other statues in the area are anonymous dudes on platforms or guys riding horses. You know, very civic, boring, who knows who those people are statues. And then you have this. So you know, this is going to be the connection between Poe and Boston is going to be, over the next few years, going to become huge, and they're going to be able to claim him in a major way. And in fact, they've already started to do so. So this week, Thursday, I believe, at the Boston Public Library, they're about to unveil a Poe bust. So, you know, in 1 month, they're kind of knocking down all the checklists for claiming a major author as one of your own. This is going to be sculpted by Brian Moore, and donated to the Boston Public Library, and those unveiled on Thursday. And suddenly, again, anybody can go see that in the library. It'll be with tons of other busts of august and important people, and you know, Poe is a Boston. That's what I got for you tonight. Like I said, you know, those are the books I have. Grimpendiums of Poe Land, all travelogues, all from a very first-person perspective. So if you don't like the way I speak, you're gonna hate the books because they're not very scholarly or any kind of like objective at all. They're me, basically. Or you can go to the website, Facebook, I'm all over the socials. Always drop me a line, especially if you guys come across interesting things that I want to know about. Definitely send them to me. I'm just very gluttonous when it comes to that kind of stuff. But I appreciate you guys coming. Hopefully you saw something interesting in one of these pictures. But thanks, guys.
Thank you.